What's going on, guys? Derek here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. And as you know, these draft strategy videos are absolutely my favorite to make. And today's video is no different. We're talking about recency bias. When we give you guys these draft strategy videos, they're little tidbits, things that you guys have to think about when you're doing your pre-draft research, because this applies to every player on the board. If you're aware of these things heading into your pre-draft research, you're going to easily be able to use this stuff to help you decide on which player is going to be right for your team. So the last strategy video we talked about utilizing the range of outcomes, super important, and this one is just as important, if not more important than that. Why do I say that? Is because if you use this tool, recency bias, that is where you can avoid the biggest overhyped players or get amazing targets at a draft day discount. Now, those are the type of moves that can really win you a league. So before we do get into it though, let's hit the stat of the day, and I do have to apologize in advance because, guys, at the time of recording, nobody has won yesterday's stat of the day yet. But if we do get a winner before that this video is released to the public, we will make sure to credit you guys with the points. So if you did get it right, fear not, you will be rewarded for it. But either way, let's jump into today's question. So today's question is going to be another difficult one, and it's going to be based off of Fantasy Football Calculator's current ADP. And even though we say not to go on Pro Football Focus and cheat for these answers, checking the ADP on Fantasy Football Calculator is not cheating whatsoever, and it's actually recommended by us. You guys should always be aware of the movers and shakers who are going up and down the draft board. So the question is, which wide receiver was top 15 in wide receiver rating per Pro Football Focus in 2017, but yet is going undrafted this year, guys? Undrafted. This one I think is going to be a difficult one for you guys, but you're all very smart, so I'm pretty sure you guys are going to get it. I think yesterday was a fluke and you're going to come back strong today. We have been getting a lot of questions about our premium package that we've been offering, and I just want to let you guys know we are releasing the premium rankings soon, but you can still gain access to all the other benefits, and you can check those out on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. If you want to sign up and become a member, it is active right now. You can sign up, make an account, and as soon as we release these rankings, which should be in the next couple of weeks, you're going to instantly have access to those. So if you guys want to, sign up today. The premium rankings this year have even taken a step up from last year, and we're not charging a penny more. We're going to have projected target shares for all players, targets for early stages, mid stages, and the late rounds of the draft, player breakdowns that are loaded with stats, obviously our sleepers and our bust, and risk ratings for all players listed. Now, we also have the Facebook group, which is one of the best benefits that you can possibly get. Every time I refresh the page, there's always a new post, and everyone's always asking great questions. These are other guys that love fantasy football, just like you and I. And if you want to toss a question in there, you're going to get answers almost immediately and start up a really good conversation on some controversial takes. But that's enough about that. Let's get into this video. That's what it's all about. Let's talk about recency bias, alright guys? So like I said, if you've been following the channel for a while, recency bias is a term that you all have heard a ton. So why do we use this term so much? Well, it's a real thing, and fantasy owners that put in the most amount of work in the offseason are the ones who are going to take the most advantage of it on draft day. But I think it's important before we go further into this video is to establish exactly what recency bias is and how it impacts us as the fantasy community. So by definition, recency bias is a person most remembering something that has happened recently compared to remembering something that may have occurred a while back. Now that definition is straight from the dictionary, but you could easily put the puzzle pieces together to see how that translates to fantasy. This is a term that's mainly used in the financial community, which should come as no surprise because we as fantasy owners have a lot in common with that field. If you break it down, we're basically analyzing data and statistics and doing our best to project future results. Now, in order to take full advantage of recency bias, you have to have a strong ability to identify these trends that are in the player data. Not only that, but then you have to use these trends and this historical data to identify any outliers. If and only if you are able to do this accurately and consistently, that's when you're going to reap most of the rewards on draft day. So if you want to dive deeper into the types of recency bias, there are a few different kinds. Each one has a varying impact on the fantasy football community, but they all have an impact on a large scale. Some of the types of recency bias include draft risk recency bias, where a player may be seen as either safe or risky based on their performance from just the previous year alone. Then you have positional group recency bias. This is where a position group finishes either strong or weak compared to previous years, and an overreaction is made on draft day, and this can be seen through their ADPs. And then you have week to week recency bias. Now this form is where a player has either a great performance in a bad matchup or a bad performance in a great matchup, and an overcorrection is made by the fantasy owner. It's a mistake that you have to avoid, but it's also a mistake that you can capitalize against other opponents in your league. So we're going to break down each one of these forms of recency bias, but I think it's most important to discuss the positional group recency bias because this is one we're seeing a lot of this season. It is absolutely no coincidence that 10 of the first 13 picks are running backs based off the current ADP. Why do I say it's no coincidence? Because the running backs had a tremendous year. It's as simple as that. Then you add on to the fact that not only did the running backs have a tremendous year, the receivers have been trending downward for the second straight year. The combination of those two occurrences are basically screaming at you to take a running back in the first round no matter what. Now hold on a second. While the data does support that this trend is not a true outlier, you can still use recency bias to your advantage. So how can you use this recency bias to your benefit? Well, it's as simple as sticking to your tier-based rankings. Tiers are made for a reason. Now, heading into the draft with the intention of drafting 1 to 2 running backs with your first 2 picks, it's not necessarily a bad strategy, and you should always have somewhat of an idea of what you want to do heading into the draft, but you also have to have that flexibility. So the only times that you're really going to be shooting yourself in the foot is when you just straight up ignore the value staring at you straight in the face. So I'm going to show you some players in this ADP range of the top 24. So based on this ADP, you see Mike Evans coming in at pick 23, just behind Jerick McKinnon at pick 22. Now, if you are a player who is in this position to make the choice between Mike Evans and Jerick McKinnon, you are likely in that pick range of a top 3 pick, meaning you have one of either Le'Veon Bell, Todd Gurley, David Johnson, Ezekiel Elliott. I'm not here to tell you which of those guys you should be taking, but the fact is you're more than likely going to have drafted one of those players. Now, if you told yourself heading into the draft that you wanted to take 2 running backs, the pick between McKinnon and Evans would be heavily favoring McKinnon. Now, in reality, the correct decision would be to go with the value. And we have Mike Evans a tier ahead of Jerick McKinnon. Just because they're in a different positional group does not mean that the tiers are completely irrelevant. We believe that there would be a significant drop-off in expected production from Mike Evans to the receivers being drafted behind him. Those receivers being Baldwin, Thielen, and Josh Gordon, while Jerick McKinnon, on the other hand, is in the same tier as the rushers in that range, that being not only himself, but Jordan Howard and Joe Mixon. We could expect to see similar production from those 3 running backs, whereas Mike Evans has top 5 upside at his position. As much as we dream of the upside of McKinnon, there is no way he could ever finish as a top 5 back. Yes, we're well aware that running backs score more points than receivers, but you really don't have the option to start an entire lineup of running backs. You're going to need to start receivers, and the top teams are going to have a combination of good running backs without sacrificing quality receivers. Don't settle for a player that's in a lower tier just to fulfill your plan heading into the draft. We understand that running backs have the glitz and the glam, but you can't completely throw out the fact that they are simply more injury prone than receivers. And if performing poorly, they have a much stronger chance of losing their involvement in the offense as opposed to receivers in that number 1 wide receiver role. Don't get us wrong, we still want you all to be able to target the running back position early. It's very important heading into this year. Just don't sacrifice upside and draft players a tier below just to fulfill your strategy heading into the draft. Now let's move over to draft risk recency bias, which is another important one. It's another form that you can use to prepare and take advantage of on draft day. We all know the term injury prone. Many people in the fantasy community love to throw around that term. And just like the narrative that people gain from character issue flaws, it could take as little as 1 season to gain that stamp on a player's outlook. So those are the negatives, and that's not the end of it. It also works the other way. 1 season of excellent performance and a player is already touted as a locked and loaded producer. The overreactions that you see from 1 season of production or lack thereof can heavily sway a player's ADP year over year. So let's take a look at a few examples of this form of recency bias and where it can be found this season. So I think a good place to start is with Adam Thielen. Everyone is willing to anoint Adam Thielen as a borderline wide receiver 1 with little to no risk. In reality though, there are some red flags that you should be thinking of when drafting Thielen. Yes, he performed at a high level last season, but he was still outscored in fantasy points per target by Stephon Diggs by nearly a half a point. And if you're looking at that stat, a half a point is a ton. Then factoring in, no matter which metric you look at, Diggs was all around the better receiver. But you guys will probably say, why does it matter? Why am I mentioning Diggs? This is about Thielen. Well, the answer to that is simple. You have Kirk Cousins coming in. Every time there's a new quarterback, it gives you a murky outlook on how the targets will get distributed. Last season is not necessarily indicative of how it's going to end out in 2018. Then you can't even throw out the fact that they have a new offensive coordinator who is going to be looking to make a name for himself. He's obviously not going to want to ruin what they built off of last season, but if he sees something working, he's not going to go ahead and throw it out just to fit the narrative of the old offensive coordinator. And if you are a betting man, you should side with the talent. The talent usually in the end in fantasy football wins out, and Diggs is the more talented receiver. Now, I'm not saying Adam Thielen sucks by any means, and it's a fact that he is less injury prone than Diggs. But, and I say but, there is a significant chance that Diggs does lead this team in targets next year, and Thielen doesn't return the value based on his current ADP. If you ask us, that is a lot of unknown when it comes to Adam Thielen, and he is being drafted at wide receiver 11, just 3 spots lower than he finished in 2017. That alone just goes to show you how much one season of good production can impact a player's ADP. Prior to this season, Adam Thielen was a double-digit round guy, and now he's being drafted as a locked and loaded wide receiver 1. Now, there is something going in Thielen's favor, and that's that the stats do reflect a trend that he has been steadily increasing in a lot of areas. So I'm not going to go ahead and say that his production was an outlier, because he has been trending upward, but it's not all that unlikely that he has reached the peak in 2017. Now, while he could certainly maintain that type of production, there are just numerous red flags that are completely being thrown out just due to the fact that he had a stellar season in 2017. So that's some overhype recency bias playing out. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. You have a player like Emmanuel Sanders, who is currently being drafted as wide receiver 36. Now, undeniably, he had a bad year. I'm not making any excuses for him. He only appeared in 12 games and he posted his lowest yardage since 2011. But if you look at Sanders' career as a whole, there really is some stuff that just doesn't add up with this ADP. Now, in his previous 3 seasons in Denver, he had compiled over 1,000 receiving yards, and excluding Manning during his historic run, he's been doing that with garbage at the quarterback position, including Brock Osweiler. Brock Osweiler that couldn't even make DeAndre Hopkins a good receiver. So yeah, he had a bad year, but he's not a bad receiver. And then heading into this season, you have some reasons to believe that he could improve on some of the numbers that he was able to accomplish in 2016 and 2015. You have a defense that's the worst that it's ever been since he's been a Bronco, a division itself that's loaded with offenses that are capable of putting up points on the board. And then we talked about how crappy the quarterbacks have been. He has a significant upgrade at the quarterback position. As much as you guys love to hate on Case Keenum, he's probably another guy who's probably immune to recency bias. He performed at a really high level and is now being drafted as like QB 28, but that's beyond the point. It is an upgrade at the quarterback position, and when you really break it down further, Demaryius Thomas, right? He had a decent year last year, but he is being drafted in nearly the same ADP that he was the year before. So what does that tell you? If Sanders would have been able to perform at his average production premiums that he had been in previous seasons, his ADP would be right where it normally would be, just like Demaryius Thomas's. But he didn't. He had a terrible year. And for that, everyone is totally writing him off, yet there are glaring signs pointing to upside. If that doesn't scream recency bias, then I have no idea what would. If you guys also have some strong recency bias candidates, leave them down in the comment section down below. But we're also going to be identifying more of these players for you in later videos and mock drafts. And spoiler, some of these guys are going to be listed in our premium package as targets throughout the draft. So this draft risk recency bias, think of it like this. Because of it, you are essentially getting these players at either an extreme discount based on the upside that they could provide you just for having a poor season the year before. Or basically you could be overpaying for these players, essentially assuming more risk than you need to just because a player is coming off of a good season. We're not anointing them saying that they can't perform at that level. We're just saying that people are putting the blinders on and ignoring these risk factors. The show must go on though, so last but not least, we have week to week recency bias. Now this is going to come into play once the season starts. But a fantasy football advice, we're not here just to prepare you for draft, we are all season long as well. So let me ask you this, have you ever owned a player, put them in your starting lineup in a good matchup, and were just completely burnt by a horrible stat line? If you've been playing fantasy football for more than a year, then it's safe to say it's happened to you, it's happened to me, and it's happened to all of us. There's just no way to avoid it. It's literally just part of the variance that we're all going to face in fantasy football. So what's the biggest mistake you could make after that happens to you? The biggest mistake you can make is to tell yourself that you can never start that player again over the one that you had benched, only to lock yourself into a tiny box with the same lineup week over week. Now, I gotta tell you guys, making the correct lineup decision does not always amount to the most amount of fantasy points. Now, I know that's a little confusing. The correct lineup decision, you think, is the one that scores the most points. Now, ideally, that's true. You want to start the players who score the most points. But the player that scores the most points is not always the right player to start. You want the player that's in the best matchup, that has the most upside. If the pendulum just doesn't swing their way that week and they're outscored by a bench player, don't kick yourself in the butt for that. It's really not your fault. You made the right decision. Almost every week you're going to have bench players that outscore your starters. So if you do end up getting burnt, don't be so hard on yourself. Make sure you're making those correct lineup decisions. And although we are huge proponents of the mindset that you have to start your stud players, when it comes to the flex players, you really can't lock yourself in to any position group or any certain player. If you are doing that, you probably have a weak bench and need to fix that because you're probably one injury away from starting a player that's on the waiver wire. That's besides the point though. When it comes to your flex players, you cannot bury a player on the bench just out of spite. You have to have a short memory span. One way I can put it into perspective is using daily fantasy. This is a common occurrence in daily fantasy. One thing that they do is they give you the ownership percentages of the players each week, and you can notice right away when a player busts, when a player burns a lot of people, you can immediately see a giant drop off in their ownership percentages the following week. If you're someone who can take advantage of recency bias, you can use that to your advantage. Having low percentage ownership players is key in winning tournaments in GPPs. Regardless, this isn't a DFS channel, so we'll kind of migrate back to season-long fantasy. The moral of the story is don't feel bad if the correct lineup decision doesn't necessarily translate to enough fantasy points to get you the win. And if you guys are having difficulties with these lineup decisions, we're going to be here throughout the season to help you guys with your starts and sits, and we'll have some content for you guys in those regards for those tough flex decisions. Now, I know this more closely relates to in-season advice, but you can still take this mindset into the draft. Bear with me here and hear me out on this one, but the reality is there are certain players that you will pass up on in the draft simply because the risk outweighs the reward. And when we're talking about making the correct decision and not being hard on yourself if it doesn't fully pan out, this is exactly what you're going to face in draft day. If a player performs to their ceiling, you can't be hard on yourself for avoiding them. An example of this is a player like Julio Jones. Right now, Julio Jones is a player that we're not going to be touching on his current ADP. Although he is one of the most physically gifted receivers in the entire league, and he could finish as the wide receiver 1 in all of fantasy, there are a number of reasons that we take into consideration that push him into our avoid list based on his current draft day price. Some of those reasons being the offense shows no clear signs of improvement, at least not immediately. Then factoring in his week-to-week consistency is going to be extremely low. And although he has been relatively healthy, at least as of recent, he does come with an increased risk of injury over other receivers in that range. Now, would we be surprised if Julio Jones finished as a top 5 wide receiver at the end of the season? The answer to that is no. And if he does, would we be wishing that we drafted him? Probably. But if we ask ourselves, did we make a mistake in our analysis in the draft process? The answer to that is no. We know the risks available, we know the rewards available, and for those drafting them, they're willing to take that risk. And everyone should be heading into the draft with clear takes on each player and understanding if they can fit into their own roster construction. The composition of your team is completely controllable on draft day, and if you want to limit your range of outcomes, Julio is probably not the player for you. But then 2 months down the road, if he finishes at his ceiling, You can't pass it off as a mistake. You have to understand these things heading into the draft. But that's a separate tangent for another video we're going to be talking about more, and that is roster construction. Stay tuned for that. That's going to be later on in the offseason, and we really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I forgot to mention we're doing the giveaway, Autograph Martavis 8x10. All you have to do is follow Nick and I on Twitter and make sure that you're subscribed to the channel. Winner will be picked on July 2nd, so good luck to all of you who enter. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.